Sometimes the people asking you to leave are the ones most afraid you will stay long enough to discover the truth. The envelope was waiting beside my dinner plate before I even sat down. It was plain white. My name was written across the front in Daniel's careful handwriting. Around me, the dining room looked exactly the way it always had during Sunday family dinners. Margaret had arranged fresh white lilies in the center of the table. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light. A roast chicken filled the room with a familiar smell that usually reminded me of comfort. Tonight, it reminded me of nothing at all. Daniel smiled when I walked in, but it was the kind of smile that ended before it reached his eyes. Margaret stood near the kitchen doorway with both hands folded in front of her. She looked calm. Too calm. Robert Hayes, the family attorney, was sitting quietly near the end of the table. His leather briefcase rested beside his chair. Seeing him there made no sense. He had never attended a family dinner before. I greeted everyone politely. No one answered with the warmth I had expected. Small conversations stopped the moment I entered the room. Forks touched plates. Glasses moved. Nobody looked directly at me for very long. I pulled out my chair and sat down. My eyes returned to the envelope. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "You should read it now," he said softly. There was no anger in his voice. There was no kindness either. I slipped one finger beneath the seal and unfolded several pages. The first line was impossible to misunderstand. Petition for dissolution of marriage. For a second, every sound disappeared. The ticking clock on the wall faded. The laughter from children playing outside vanished. Even my own breathing seemed distant. I looked back at Daniel. He lowered his eyes toward his plate. Margaret reached for her water glass, but did not drink. Robert remained completely still, watching without expression. I slowly placed the papers back inside the envelope. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not ask anyone why. Instead, I folded my hands together on the table. "I will need time before I sign anything," I said quietly. Margaret was the first to respond. "Emily, this is for everyone's future. It is better if we handle this with dignity." Her words sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. Daniel nodded without looking at me. "It will be easier this way," he added. Easier for whom? I wondered. I searched their faces, hoping someone would reveal a hint of uncertainty. Instead, I found careful control. Every movement felt measured. Every sentence sounded prepared. It was as though this conversation had happened many times before I ever entered the room. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. The silence seemed to make everyone uncomfortable. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. Daniel tapped one finger against the edge of the table before quickly stopping himself. Robert adjusted the corner of a document inside his briefcase, but never opened it. Tiny details. Tiny cracks. Tiny moments that refused to fit together. If this divorce had truly been a mutual decision, why did everyone seem nervous? Why was the family attorney already here before I had even spoken? Why had no one warned me that tonight would change my life? I stood from my chair and offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you for dinner," I said. "I will read everything carefully." Daniel finally looked at me. There was surprise in his eyes. Perhaps he had expected shouting. Perhaps he had expected tears. Instead, I picked up the envelope, collected my purse, and walked calmly toward the front door. As I reached the hallway, I heard Margaret whisper something too softly to understand. Daniel answered with only 3 words. "She knows nothing." I paused for the briefest moment without turning around. Then I quietly stepped outside into the cool evening air, holding the envelope a little tighter as one simple thought settled into my mind. If they believed I knew nothing, I intended to let them keep believing it. The drive home felt much longer than 20 minutes. I never turned on the radio. The envelope rested on the passenger seat beside me, untouched since I had left the house. Every time I stopped at a traffic light, I glanced at it without reaching for it. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had disappeared behind the neighboring homes, leaving the quiet street covered in soft evening shadows. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of water, and carefully removed the documents from the envelope once again. This time I read every page from beginning to end. The language was formal. The requests were simple. The signatures were missing. Mine was the only one they still needed. I noticed something else. Several pages referred to financial disclosures that were supposedly attached. They were not there. I counted the documents twice. The attachments were missing both times. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Perhaps it was an innocent mistake. Perhaps it was not. Daniel had always been organized. He checked every bill twice. He filed tax returns months before the deadline. Forgetting important financial documents did not sound like him. My phone vibrated on the table. His name appeared on the screen. I waited until the ringing stopped before reading the voicemail notification. A few seconds later, another message arrived. It was short. Please do not make this harder than it needs to be. I read the sentence several times. Not once did he ask how I was feeling. Not once did he explain why this had happened. The next message came from Margaret. We hope you will sign soon. This will allow everyone to move forward peacefully. Everyone. The word stayed with me. Everyone except me, apparently. I set the phone aside without answering either message. Instead, I opened the small filing cabinet beside my desk. Over the years, I had kept copies of mortgage statements, insurance papers, property tax receipts, and family records. Daniel often joked that I saved everything. Tonight, I was grateful for the habit. I compared the divorce papers with older financial documents. Most of the information matched. One address did not. It referred to a mailing location I had never seen before. I checked it again. The unfamiliar address appeared twice on separate pages. That alone did not prove anything, but it was enough to make me curious. Curiosity replaced panic. Panic solved nothing. Careful attention sometimes solved everything. I closed the folder and made myself a cup of tea. As I stood by the kitchen window, I remembered something Margaret had said months earlier during a holiday dinner. She had smiled while telling everyone that families should never question each other's intentions. At the time, it had sounded wise. Tonight, it sounded strangely convenient. My phone rang once more. Daniel again. This time I answered. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he sighed. Emily, I really think signing quickly is best. His voice sounded tired, almost rehearsed. Best for whom? I asked quietly. Another pause followed. For everyone. The same word again. Everyone. Can you explain why Robert was already there before I even opened the envelope? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Mother thought having everything prepared would make the process easier. Easier. Another carefully chosen word. I need time, I said. I am reading everything carefully. There is nothing complicated, he replied. Then you will not mind if I have someone review the documents. Silence filled the call. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Do whatever you think you need to do, he finally answered before ending the conversation. I placed the phone on the table and looked once more at the unfamiliar mailing address. Something inside me settled. They believed I would react emotionally. Instead, I would react patiently. Tomorrow morning, I would begin asking quiet questions. I would tell no one what I found. If there truly was nothing hidden, I would know soon enough. But if there was even one piece of the story that had been kept from me, I intended to find it before I signed a single page. The next morning began quietly. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and placed the divorce papers beside my notebook. For the first time since the envelope had appeared on the dinner table, I felt something unexpected. I was no longer afraid. I was curious. Fear asks endless questions without expecting answers. Curiosity quietly goes looking for them. I opened my laptop and typed the unfamiliar mailing address into a public property database. Nothing appeared at first. I checked the spelling again. Still nothing. Then I removed the apartment number listed in the documents and searched only the street address. This time a commercial office building appeared. It was not connected to Daniel's employer. It was not connected to our bank. It was the registered mailing address of a small legal services company downtown. I wrote the name in my notebook. It could have meant nothing. It could have meant everything. Instead of making assumptions, I decided to collect facts. Around mid-morning, I drove to the county records office. The building was quiet, filled with people requesting permits, licenses, and public documents. I waited my turn, smiled politely, and asked for copies of property records connected to our home. The clerk handed me several printed pages after verifying the address. Everything looked normal until I noticed an amendment filed only 4 months earlier. I frowned. I did not remember signing anything related to the property during that time. Perhaps I had forgotten. Perhaps it had involved routine paperwork. Still, I made a copy and placed it inside my folder. Before leaving, I thanked the clerk and walked back to my car. The summer air felt warm, but my thoughts remained unusually calm. One strange document did not prove deception. It only proved that I needed to keep looking. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Margaret. I answered after a moment. "Emily, I hope you are taking care of yourself," she said warmly. Her voice sounded gentle, almost comforting. "I am doing fine," I replied. "Have you had time to review everything?" she asked. "I have started." Another brief silence followed. "There is no reason to delay," she continued. "Dragging this out only makes it harder for everyone." There was that word again. Everyone. I glanced at the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. "I prefer understanding what I sign," I answered. Margaret laughed softly. "Daniel has already explained everything." "Not completely," I said. Her laughter disappeared. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I simply have a few questions." "Questions? About what?" she asked quickly. I smiled without realizing it. For someone encouraging me not to worry, she seemed unusually interested in what I had discovered. "Nothing important," I replied. "Just routine questions." She ended the conversation a few moments later, sounding less relaxed than before. I drove to a small neighborhood cafe before returning home. While stirring my coffee, I opened the folder again. The amendment carried a witness signature I did not recognize. I searched my memory. The date matched a weekend when Daniel had insisted on handling several financial errands alone because I had been visiting my sister in another state. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. Now the memory settled differently. Not as proof, as another puzzle piece. That afternoon, I called our bank to request copies of statements from the previous year. The representative explained that I could pick them up the following day with proper identification. I thanked her and ended the call. Everything I requested was public or belonged to me. I was not breaking trust. I was protecting myself. As evening approached, Daniel sent another text message. "Mother says you seem worried. There is no reason to investigate anything." I stared at the screen for several seconds. I had never told Margaret where I had been. I had never mentioned public records, the courthouse, or the property amendment. Yet somehow she believed I was investigating. I slowly locked my phone and placed it face down on the table. Until that moment, I had wondered whether I was imagining patterns that did not exist. That single message erased the doubt. Someone was paying very close attention to what I might discover. And if they were watching me that carefully, then I was finally looking in the right direction. The following morning, I arrived at the bank a few minutes before it opened. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the cool morning air gave me time to organize my thoughts before walking inside. I reminded myself that I was not looking for reasons to distrust anyone. I was looking for facts. Facts did not become less true simply because they were uncomfortable. After presenting my identification, I requested copies of our joint account statements from the previous year. The bank representative smiled politely and disappeared into a back office. While I waited, I watched customers come and go without thinking much about the ordinary routines filling their day. Mine no longer felt ordinary. A few minutes later, she returned with a neatly organized folder. I thanked her and carried it to a small seating area before opening the first page. Most transactions looked exactly as I expected. Mortgage payments, utility bills, grocery stores, insurance. Everything followed the familiar rhythm of daily life. Then I noticed several transfers made over a period of 3 months. Each payment was modest by itself, but together they represented a significant amount of money. Every transfer had been sent to the same legal services company whose address I had discovered the day before. I checked the dates twice. They all occurred before anyone had ever mentioned divorce. My heart beat a little faster, but I forced myself to slow down. Jumping to conclusions would only cloud my judgment. I copied the transaction numbers into my notebook before placing the statements neatly back inside the folder. As I walked toward my car, I remembered another small detail that had seemed meaningless at the time. Nearly 6 months earlier, Daniel had insisted on handling all of our annual financial paperwork himself. He had smiled and told me I deserved a break after working so hard throughout the year. I had thanked him without giving it another thought. Standing beside my car, I realized how easily kindness could hide important decisions when trust already existed. Instead of driving home immediately, I stopped at a quiet public library. The reading room was peaceful, filled with soft voices and the gentle sound of turning pages. I spread my documents across a large wooden table and compared dates, addresses, and signatures. Little by little, a pattern began to appear. None of the individual pieces looked alarming on their own. Together, they suggested preparation that had started long before the envelope appeared at dinner. I was still studying the records when my telephone rang. Daniel. Again. I answered calmly. He sounded unusually cheerful. He asked whether I wanted to meet for coffee later that afternoon. It was the first time since the divorce papers appeared that he had suggested seeing me in person. I agreed without hesitation. If he wanted a conversation, I wanted to hear every word he chose carefully enough to say. We met at the same neighborhood cafe where we had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries over the years. Daniel arrived a few minutes late, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He smiled politely as he placed one in front of me. The conversation began with ordinary questions about work and the weather. It felt strangely rehearsed, as though we were both reading from different scripts. Finally, he leaned forward. Emily, Mother is worried that you are making this more complicated than it needs to be. I stirred my coffee slowly before answering. Complicated situations deserve careful decisions. He sighed quietly. There is nothing hidden here. I looked at him for several seconds. Then you will not mind if I continue asking questions until I understand everything. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. It lasted only a moment before the polite smile returned. I just want this to end peacefully, he said. So do I replied. Peace built on honesty lasts much longer. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. People entered the cafe, collected their drinks, and returned to their busy lives while silence settled between us. As we stood to leave, Daniel reached for my hand, but I gently stepped back. Not out of anger, out of uncertainty. On my way home, I replayed every sentence from our conversation. He had denied that anything was hidden, yet he had never asked what I had actually discovered. That realization stayed with me all evening. Truly innocent people usually wanted to know the questions. Daniel only wanted me to stop asking them. Before going to bed, I placed every document inside a new folder and wrote 3 simple words across the front with a black marker. Read before signing. Then I locked the folder inside my desk, already knowing that whatever came next would depend not on emotions, but on the truth waiting somewhere inside those pages. The next morning, I carried the folder with me before leaving the house. I had slept only a few hours, yet my mind felt clearer than it had in days. Every document I had collected pointed in the same direction. None of them proved dishonesty by themselves, but together they suggested that important decisions had been made long before I was invited to that family dinner. Instead of guessing what those decisions meant, I decided to speak with someone who had no personal interest in the outcome. I scheduled a consultation with an independent family law attorney recommended by a colleague from work. Her office occupied the 2nd floor of a quiet brick building overlooking a small public park. The waiting room was simple and peaceful. Framed photographs of local landscapes covered the walls, and soft instrumental music played in the background. When my appointment began, I placed every paper on the conference table in the exact order I had organized them. The attorney listened without interrupting while I explained everything from the envelope at dinner to the missing financial disclosures, the unfamiliar mailing address, the property amendment, and the repeated payments sent to the legal services company months before anyone mentioned divorce. She read carefully for nearly 20 minutes before finally looking up. You have done the right thing by waiting, she said. Never sign legal documents until every question has been answered. Those words alone made me feel less isolated. She continued reviewing the paperwork, occasionally making notes in the margins of her legal pad. Finally, she pointed to one section of the financial disclosure forms. These references indicate supporting documents should exist. Without reviewing those documents, you cannot fully understand the proposal. I nodded slowly. That confirmed the concern that had been growing inside me from the very beginning. Before I left, she advised me to request every missing record in writing and to avoid discussing my findings with Daniel or Margaret until I understood the complete picture. I thanked her and walked outside feeling calmer than I had since receiving the divorce papers. On the drive home, my telephone rang again. This time it was Margaret. I answered after connecting the call through my car speakers. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She invited me to another family dinner that weekend. We all miss you, she said warmly. It would be good for everyone if we sat down together again. I almost smiled. Only a few days earlier, everyone had seemed eager for me to leave quietly. Now they wanted another gathering. I appreciate the invitation, I replied. I will come. There was a brief pause before she added, Daniel hopes we can finally settle everything. I answered politely without making any promises. After ending the call, I thought about the change in tone. Pressure had become friendliness. Urgency had become patience. Something had shifted, although I did not yet know why. That afternoon, I stopped by my mailbox and found a certified letter waiting inside. The return address belonged to the same legal services company that had appeared repeatedly throughout my investigation. I carried the unopened envelope into the kitchen, placed it beside the original divorce papers, and looked at both for several moments. One envelope had started this journey. Perhaps the second would explain where it was leading. I opened it carefully. Inside was a formal request asking me to acknowledge receipt of additional legal documents at the upcoming family meeting. Attached was a schedule listing Robert Hayes as the attending attorney. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note that had clearly been added after the document was printed. Please bring all previously provided paperwork. I read the sentence twice. They believed I would arrive carrying only the papers they had given me. They had no idea I had already gathered records of my own. I quietly placed the new letter into my folder beside everything else. Then I closed the cover and rested my hand on top of it for a moment. The coming dinner would no longer be about convincing me to sign. It would become an opportunity to observe everyone together once again. People often revealed more through ordinary conversation than they ever intended. This time I planned to. Notice every glance, every hesitation, every carefully chosen word, because somewhere inside those small moments I believed the truth was waiting. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually cool air for early autumn. I left home carrying only my handbag and the folder that had quietly grown thicker over the past week. Every document inside had been organized in chronological order. I had highlighted dates, circled unfamiliar addresses, and attached small notes wherever questions remained unanswered. I was no longer trying to prove that anyone had done something wrong. I simply wanted every piece of the story to fit together honestly. Margaret welcomed me at the front door with the same warm smile she had shown neighbors for years. "I am so glad you came," she said as though nothing unusual had happened between us. Her voice sounded gentle, but her eyes immediately dropped toward the folder in my hand before returning to my face. It lasted only a second. It was enough. Inside, the dining room looked almost identical to the evening when the divorce papers first appeared. Fresh flowers decorated the table. Candles remained unlit in the afternoon sunlight. Daniel stood near the window speaking quietly with Robert Hayes. When they noticed me, their conversation ended instantly. Robert greeted me politely. Daniel walked over and pulled out my chair. His kindness felt carefully measured. Everyone seemed determined to keep the afternoon pleasant. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, a neighbor's retirement, a local charity event. Margaret poured coffee for everyone while asking whether work had been busy lately. She smiled often. Daniel laughed at small jokes that normally would not have interested him. The atmosphere felt almost rehearsed, as though each person had agreed in advance to avoid mentioning the reason we were together. Finally, Robert placed a slim leather portfolio on the table. "Before we discuss anything further," he said calmly, "I would like to confirm that everyone has received the documents previously provided." Margaret immediately looked toward me. Daniel followed a moment later. I nodded. "Yes," I answered. "I received the documents that were sent to me." My choice of words seemed to surprise Robert. He paused briefly before continuing. "Very good. We hope today's conversation will help everyone move forward." Margaret folded her hands together. "Emily, we all want what is best for the family." I smiled politely. "I believe that as well." She appeared relieved by my answer. Daniel leaned forward. "Have you decided whether you are ready to sign?" he asked. I took a slow sip of coffee before responding. "I have decided to continue learning everything I should understand before making that decision." Silence settled over the room. Nobody interrupted it. Robert adjusted his glasses and glanced toward Daniel. Margaret gently placed her coffee cup onto the table with more care than necessary. Daniel forced another smile. "What else do you need to know?" he asked. I opened my folder without removing any papers. "There are several financial attachments missing from the original packet," I said calmly. I also noticed references to legal services that began months before anyone discussed divorce with me. I would simply appreciate understanding the timeline. Nobody answered immediately. Margaret finally spoke. "Those details are administrative. They are not important." I looked at her with the same calm expression I had practiced all week. Administrative details become important when someone is asked to sign legal documents. Robert slowly closed his portfolio without saying a word. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time since this process began, no one encouraged me to hurry. Instead, they exchanged quick glances that seemed to ask silent questions of one another. I noticed every one of them. The room had not become louder. It had become more careful. After another long pause, Robert cleared his throat. Perhaps it would be helpful if we scheduled one final meeting after everyone has had an opportunity to review any remaining records. Margaret looked surprised by the suggestion, but she did not argue. Daniel quietly agreed. I thanked Robert for the recommendation and closed my folder. As lunch continued, conversation returned to ordinary subjects, yet something fundamental had changed. They no longer believed I would quietly accept every explanation placed before me. More importantly, they no longer seemed certain that they all understood the same story themselves. As I drove home that evening, one realization stayed with me. I had not presented a single piece of evidence from my own investigation. I had asked only a few simple questions. Those questions alone had been enough to change the entire atmosphere around the table. And if honest questions created that much discomfort, I could only imagine what honest answers might reveal. The days following the family dinner passed more quietly than I expected. No one called to pressure me. No new deadlines appeared. The sudden silence felt unusual after so many reminders to sign the paperwork quickly. Instead of feeling relieved, I became even more attentive. Sometimes silence is simply another way people wait for you to make the mistake they could not persuade you to make. Early Tuesday morning, I received an electronic message from Robert Hayes. It was brief and professional. He explained that additional financial records had been collected and invited both Daniel and me to attend one final document review later that week. The wording immediately caught my attention. It no longer referred to signing papers. It referred only to reviewing records. That small change told me something had already shifted behind the scenes. I accepted the invitation within minutes. Later that afternoon, my independent attorney called after reviewing several public filings I had requested. Her voice remained calm as always. I cannot tell you what anyone intended, she said, but I can tell you that your questions were appropriate. Several documents reference amendments that deserve clarification before any agreement is signed. She encouraged me to bring every record I had collected, even if I believed some of them were insignificant. Small details often explain larger decisions, she reminded me. I thanked her, closed my notebook, and realized how different I felt compared to the woman who had opened the first envelope only days earlier. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. On Thursday afternoon, I arrived at Robert's office a few minutes early. The conference room overlooked downtown streets filled with people beginning their evening commute. Sunlight reflected across the polished table where several neatly stacked folders had already been arranged. Daniel entered shortly after I did. He smiled politely, but the confidence I had seen during the first family dinner had faded. He looked tired. Margaret arrived last, carrying herself with the same dignity she always displayed, although she spoke much less than usual. Robert greeted everyone and invited us to sit. Without unnecessary conversation, he opened the largest folder and began reviewing the financial timeline. One page after another appeared on the table. Property records, banking summaries, legal correspondence, administrative filings. Everything was presented carefully and without emotion. Then Robert paused. He adjusted his glasses and looked toward Daniel. Before we continue, he said, there is one matter that should be clarified for everyone's understanding. The room became completely still. Daniel slowly nodded, but said nothing. Robert continued. Some of the preliminary legal work began several months before the formal divorce documents were delivered. That preparation has raised understandable questions. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. I noticed her hands tighten around her coffee cup before relaxing again. Daniel looked toward the window instead of at me. Robert remained composed. Preparation itself is not unusual, he explained. However, when communication between family members is incomplete, misunderstandings naturally follow. I listened without interrupting. I had promised myself from the beginning that I would let facts speak before emotions. Robert turned another page. Emily requested clarification regarding missing supporting documents. Those documents have now been assembled. He slid a folder across the table toward me. I opened it carefully. Every attachment that had been missing from the original packet was finally there. I examined the pages one by one without rushing. Several questions that had troubled me for days were answered immediately. Others remained. I looked up calmly. Thank you for providing these, I said. Robert nodded. You were entitled to receive them from the beginning. Daniel closed his eyes briefly before speaking. Emily, I honestly believed you had already been given everything. His voice carried uncertainty rather than certainty for the first time. I studied his expression. It no longer looked rehearsed. It looked confused. Margaret finally spoke. The intention was never to keep information from anyone. Her sentence sounded careful, almost defensive. I simply answered, intentions are easier to understand when information is complete. No one argued with that. The meeting continued for another hour as documents were reviewed page by page. By the time we stood to leave, one important truth had become impossible to ignore. The story I had been given at the beginning was incomplete. Whether that had happened through poor judgment, assumptions, or something else remained unanswered. But everyone in that room now understood the same thing I had realized days earlier. The truth could no longer be rushed, simplified, or hidden behind polite conversations. From that moment forward, every decision would have to stand on complete facts rather than carefully chosen words. When I returned home after the meeting, I did not open the folder again that evening. For the first time since everything had begun, I no longer felt the need to search for another missing piece before allowing myself to rest. I made a simple dinner, opened the living room windows, and listened to the quiet sounds of the neighborhood settling into the evening. My telephone remained silent. No messages from Daniel. No calls from Margaret. The silence felt different now. It no longer carried pressure. It carried uncertainty. The next morning, I received a message from Robert Hayes asking whether I would be available for one final conversation before any legal documents moved forward. I agreed immediately. A few hours later, I arrived at his office carrying only my notebook. This time, there was no stack of folders waiting on the conference table. Robert greeted me with a warm handshake before taking a seat across from me. I wanted to speak with you privately, he said. Sometimes people make decisions before they fully understand the consequences. I believe everyone involved understands the situation much more clearly now. I nodded but remained silent. Robert continued, no one can tell you what decision to make. That choice belongs only to you. My responsibility is making sure every decision is informed. Those words stayed with me. Throughout the previous week, nearly everyone had focused on persuading me toward a specific outcome. Robert was the first person who focused only on making sure I understood every option. He handed me a final summary explaining the legal process, my rights, and the practical consequences of each possible path. Nothing in the document attempted to influence me. It simply presented facts. I thanked him sincerely before leaving the office. On the drive home, I realized something had quietly changed inside me. At the beginning of this journey, I had believed my greatest challenge would be discovering what other people were hiding. Now I understood that my greatest responsibility was deciding what kind of future I wanted for myself. That afternoon, Daniel called. His voice sounded calmer than it had in weeks. Would you meet me one more time? He asked. Just the two of us. I agreed. We met at a small park where we had often walked together after work during the early years of our marriage. Autumn leaves covered the walking paths, and families pushed strollers beneath tall maple trees. We sat on a bench overlooking a quiet pond. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I owe you an apology, he said softly. I kept believing everything would become easier if we moved quickly. I never stopped to ask whether you had everything you needed to make your own decision. I looked across the water before answering. That was the hardest part. Not the documents. Not the meetings. It was realizing that everyone expected me to agree before I understood. Daniel lowered his head. I see that now. His words sounded sincere, but sincerity could not erase everything that had happened. We continued talking for nearly an hour. There was no arguing, no accusations, only honest conversation that had arrived much later than it should have. When we finally stood to leave, Daniel looked at me with quiet uncertainty. Have you decided what you are going to do? He asked. I smiled gently. Yes. He waited for the answer. I did not give it. You will know soon enough, I said. As I walked back toward my car, I realized something that surprised even me. My decision was no longer driven by disappointment, anger, or fear. It had become something much simpler. I wanted a future built on openness, mutual respect, and complete honesty. If those things could no longer exist inside my marriage, then pretending otherwise would only prolong the pain for both of us. Later that evening, I placed every document back into the folder one final time. Then I wrote a single sentence on the inside cover where only I would ever see it. The strongest decision is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it is simply the one that allows you to recognize your own worth without asking anyone else for permission. The following morning, I would attend the final meeting, carrying not only the documents that had changed everything, but also a decision that no one in that family expected me to make. The final meeting began on a quiet Friday morning beneath clear blue skies. As I walked into Robert Hayes's office, I noticed that everything looked simpler than before. There were no large stacks of paperwork waiting on the conference table. Only a single folder rested in front of each chair. Daniel stood when I entered. Margaret greeted me with a polite smile that carried none of the confidence she had shown during our first family dinner. Robert invited us to sit before calmly explaining that every requested document had now been provided, every financial record had been reviewed, and every remaining question had been answered. There would be no surprises today, only decisions. He looked toward me first. "Emily," he said, "you now have complete information. Whatever choice you make today will be based on a full understanding of the circumstances." I thanked him before opening the folder one final time. I slowly turned each page, not because I needed to read them again, but because I wanted to remind myself how different this moment felt from the evening when an envelope had appeared beside my dinner plate without warning. Back then, everyone expected me to react immediately. Today, no one interrupted my silence. When I finally closed the folder, I looked at Daniel. His expression reflected regret more than certainty. "I owe you another apology," he said quietly. "I confused speed with fairness. I believed solving a problem quickly was the same as solving it correctly. I understand now that I was wrong." Margaret lowered her eyes before speaking. "I also made assumptions about what would be best for everyone. I should have trusted you enough to include you in every conversation from the beginning." Her words sounded sincere. I appreciated hearing them, even though they could not change the path that had brought us here. I folded my hands together and took a slow breath. "I have spent the past several days asking questions," I said calmly. "Not because I wanted conflict, but because I needed clarity. I discovered that trust is not damaged by difficult conversations. Trust is damaged when people decide someone else does not deserve the complete truth." The room remained silent. Robert simply listened. Daniel nodded slightly. I continued. "I have made my decision." Everyone looked toward me. "I will move forward with the divorce." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment before quietly accepting my answer. There was sadness in the room, but there was no anger. I continued speaking before anyone else could respond. "I am not making this decision because I hate anyone. I am making it because I finally understand what I need in order to build a peaceful future. I need openness before decisions are made. I need respect before expectations are created. I need honesty before promises are given. Once those foundations disappear, pretending everything is still strong only delays the inevitable." Robert nodded thoughtfully before organizing the final documents. Every signature that followed felt different from the one everyone had expected a week earlier. I was no longer signing because I had been pressured. I was signing because I had been given the opportunity to understand everything first. That difference mattered more than anyone else in the room could fully appreciate. Several months later, my life looked quieter, but it also felt lighter. I moved into a comfortable townhouse not far from the park where Daniel and I had shared our last conversation. I filled the rooms with books, fresh flowers, and photographs that reminded me of joyful moments instead of painful ones. I volunteered at a local community center on weekends and slowly rediscovered interests I had neglected for years. One afternoon, I received a handwritten note from Margaret. She thanked me for handling every difficult moment with dignity and wished me happiness in whatever came next. I smiled gently before placing the letter inside a keepsake box. Forgiveness did not require forgetting. It simply meant refusing to let yesterday decide tomorrow. As I stood by my living room window watching children ride bicycles along the quiet street, I realized the greatest surprise had never been the divorce itself. The greatest surprise was discovering that choosing myself did not leave me with less. It gave me the freedom to build a life founded on honesty, self-respect, and peace. Sometimes the bravest ending is simply the beginning you finally choose for yourself.